All right, today we're tackling a really tough subject, some of the most cruel and brutal deaths that have been recorded throughout history. And look, we're not doing this for shock value. The whole point here is to try and understand the different ways cruelty can show up, from raw hatred and state-sponsored punishment to, the unintentional horrors of our modern world. It's about reflecting on what these awful events tell us about our past and maybe even ourselves. So, let's dive in.
So here's how we're going to break this down. We'll be looking at 4 very different cases. We're going to start with the murder that helped light the fuse for the American Civil Rights Movement. Then we'll jump way back in time to see 2 examples of just extreme public torture in 16th century Europe. After that, we're going to face a modern tragedy, one that came from a nuclear accident. And then at the end, we'll talk about why it's so incredibly important to remember these dark chapters of our history.
Okay, so our first story starts in Mississippi, back in the summer of 1955. Now, you have to remember, this was the era of Jim Crow. This was a time of intense, state-enforced racial segregation and just brutal discrimination against Black Americans. And it's into this powder keg that a 14-year-old kid from Chicago named Emmett Till comes to visit his relatives. And he had no idea what was about to happen to him.
And what's so terrifying is just how fast this all went down. It all kicked off with an incident at a local grocery store on August 24th. Just 4 days later, in the middle of the night, he's dragged out of his great-uncle's house at gunpoint. And then, only 3 days after that, his body is found in a river. Just like that, a kid's life was gone in a single horrific week.
The level of brutality here, it's just off the charts. He was taken to a barn and he was beaten so badly that his face was completely unrecognizable. They gouged out one of his eyes, they mutilated him, and then they shot him in the head. And just to make sure he'd sink, they tied a huge 75-pound cotton gin fan around his neck with barbed wire and dumped his body into the Tallahatchie River.
So you have to ask, what could possibly have been the reason for this? What was the excuse? Well, the store owner's wife, a woman named Carolyn Bryant, claimed that Till had whistled at her and grabbed her. But here's the absolute kicker. Decades later, she admitted to a historian that she had made parts of it up. Her testimony was false. The whole thing, the whole terrible event, was built on a lie. And still, an all-white jury let her husband and his half-brother walk free after deliberating for barely an hour.
But that's not where this story ends. Not even close. Emmett's mother, Mamie Till Mobley, made one of the bravest decisions imaginable. She demanded an open-casket funeral. She said something that echoed through history. "Let the people see what I've seen." The photos of her son's disfigured body were published, and for the first time, the world saw the true face of racial violence in America. It was a shock to the system. That single act became a massive catalyst for the civil rights movement. In fact, Rosa Parks herself later said that when she refused to give up her seat on that bus, she was thinking of Emmett Till.
All right, let's switch gears and travel way, way back to the 16th century. This was a time when cruelty wasn't something hidden. It was actually put on display, like a show. A man named Balthazar Gerard had just assassinated William the Silent, a major leader in the Dutch Revolt. His sentence was designed from the ground up to be a terrifying public warning. But the execution itself, that was just the grand finale.
And get this, before he was even taken out for the main event, Gerard was tortured for 3 straight days with this almost scientifically cruel precision. On the first night, they whipped him and then smeared his wounds with honey so a goat would lick them raw. Then they tied him up in a tight ball so there was no way he could sleep. They forced his feet into these specially made dogskin shoes that were designed to shrink when heated, crushing his feet. They branded his armpits, drove sharp nails under his fingernails and toenails. It's just one horror after another.
It was only after all of that, after days of this agony, that they finally brought him out to the market square. In front of a crowd, they tore his flesh with red-hot pincers, and some accounts say they cut his heart out while he was still alive. Finally, he was beheaded and his body was cut into pieces, which were then put on display on the city gates. You see, this wasn't just about punishing one guy. This was a message, a horrifying, brutal message from the state, meant to show everyone what happens when you challenge authority.
Okay, so we've seen the calculated cruelty of the past. Now we're going to jump forward to a completely different kind of nightmare, one that could only happen in our modern technological age. This is the story of Hisashi Ochi, who was a technician at a nuclear facility in Japan back in 1999.
Uchi and his colleagues were prepping uranium fuel, and apparently they were in a rush, they broke safety rules, and as he was pouring uranium solution into a big tank, he accidentally started an uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction. It's called a criticality event. He saw a bright blue flash of light, and in that single moment, his body was soaked in a level of radiation that's just, well, it's impossible to survive.
Let's talk about this number, 17 sieverts. To really understand what happened, you have to grasp what this means. A dose of just 8 sieverts is considered 100% fatal. Ochi took in more than double that. This amount of radiation didn't just make him sick. It literally destroyed his body at the most fundamental level. His chromosomes, the very genetic blueprint for his entire body, were shattered. His DNA was, for all intents and purposes, completely erased.
What came next was, well, it was 83 days of an agony that's hard to even describe. At first, the symptoms didn't seem that bad, but then his immune system just vanished. His skin started peeling off in huge sheets. His body couldn't make new cells, couldn't heal itself at all. They kept him alive with an army of machines, constant blood transfusions, skin grafts, all while he was in excruciating pain as his internal organs just dissolved. On the 59th day, his heart actually stopped beating, but doctors revived him again and again, basically restarting his heart to prolong this suffering, until, finally, on day 83, his body just gave up for good.
For our last story, we're going back to the 16th century one more time. This one is all about religious war and, once again, punishment as a public show. In 1534, a radical religious group took over the German city of Münster. When their rebellion was finally put down, the leaders were made to face an end that was just as theatrical as it was horrifying.
So picture this. The 3 leaders were tied to a pole, and each one had an iron collar with spikes on the inside locked around his neck. Then, for 1 solid hour, executioners used red-hot tongs to tear pieces of flesh from their bodies. They say that if any of them passed out, they would just wait for him to wake up before they started again. After a full hour of this, they pulled their tongues out with hot clamps, and only then did they finally kill them with a dagger through the heart.
And you'd think it would end there, right? But no. After they were dead, their bodies were put inside 3 iron cages, which were then hoisted up onto the steeple of St. Lambert's Church for everyone to see. It was a permanent warning. And here's the part that is just unbelievable. The bones were taken out about 50 years later, but those exact same cages are still hanging there today. Almost 500 years later, you can go to Münster and see them, a physical, chilling reminder of that brutal day.
So there you have it, 4 completely different stories, 4 terrible moments in time. Each one shows us a different side of cruelty. Each one had a different reason behind it, but they all ended in just unthinkable suffering.
And I think what this really shows is that cruelty, it isn't just one thing. For Emmett Till, it came from pure, ugly racial hatred. For Gerard and the Münster leaders, it was a cold, calculated political tool used to create fear and keep control. And for Hisashi Ouchi, it was something else entirely. A modern nightmare, born from an accident, and maybe from technology that just wouldn't let go.
Look, going through these stories is tough. It's supposed to be. But it's so important that we do. They force us to look at the worst parts of human nature, whether that cruelty comes from hate, or from a desire for power, or even from a tragic mistake. Which really leaves us with one big question, for all of us. When we look at these histories, from the open casket of a murdered boy to the empty cages still hanging on a church, how do we make sure these dark moments serve as a permanent warning, and not a blueprint for the future?